Welcome everybody to this evening's lecture, which is sponsored by the AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Awards program as part of its annual fall lecture series. The awards program, which the American Association for the Advancement of Science has administered since 1945, recognizes distinguished reporting on science for a general audience. And thanks to a generous endowment by the Kavli Foundation, which is also the sponsor of our campus's Kavli Center for Ethics, Science, and the Public, the Science Journalism Contest has been open to journalists worldwide since 2015. I'm Elena Konis, a member of the faculty here in the School of Journalism and the Department of History, but I'm here to welcome today our speaker, Amy Maxmen, who won the AAAS Kavli Gold Award in 2020 for her story in Nature titled Behind the Front Lines of the Ebola Wars. That report covered the violence and intimidation strangling the WHO's response to Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where, as Amy reported, the organization's massive team on the ground faced death threats and stones, bullets, and grenades as they worked. In the years leading up to the outbreak, thousands of civilians had been massacred by local militias, and thousands more disappeared. The people here don't believe that anyone cares for them, not even their own government, the WHO's leading response official told Amy. So it's very hard to convince them that we're actually here to help. In a closing passage in that piece that resonates still to this day, Amy wrote that curbing Ebola should be straightforward with political stability and a robust health system. But in their absence, a cycle of tragic, multi-million-dollar health disasters will continue to flourish. Quote, "As long as places are this vulnerable, this will keep happening," the WHO's Director General told her. "We will fix Ebola, and it will come back tomorrow." For obvious reasons, Amy wasn't able to share the story of that reporting with us here in 2020, when she was named the recipient of this award. But she's speaking tonight instead, after an altogether different outbreak, one that has left its own mark on her work. We're just as honored as we would have been 2 years ago to welcome Amy to this campus, because we know that in this time she's taken her work in equally important new directions, some of which she's going to share with us tonight. But first, just a few words about Amy. She's a science journalist, trained on this campus originally, where she was an undergrad some time ago. She left here to get a PhD in evolutionary biology at Harvard, and this afternoon she shared with some of our students, some of whom I see here, some tips and advice and the story of how she leapt from scientist to eminent science writer. For over a decade now, Amy Maxmen has reported on global health, infectious diseases, and biological research around the world for Nature, the New York Times, and National Geographic, among other outlets. She's currently the Edward R. Murrow Press Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. She's won several awards for her reporting, including the 2020 AAAS Kavli Award, the 2021 Victor Cohn Prize for Excellence in Medical Science Reporting, the Communications Award from the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, and a first place prize from the Association of Healthcare Journalists, all for stories on topics ranging from drug-resistant malaria in Myanmar and Cambodia to COVID and inequity in California. And that brings us to the topic of tonight's talk on inequality as a frontier for science journalism. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. That was a very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. As you heard, I did go to undergraduate here at Berkeley, which I really loved. The thing that blew my mind, first of all, was going to the tide pools in my invertebrate zoology class and just seeing all of these crazy and strange creatures and thinking about how they're related to each other and how we're related to them. I ended up doing a thesis with the professor who taught that class, David Limberg, and I studied the evolution of limpets. These are these sort of volcano-looking mollusks that are here on the rock. Here's another photo with some limpets in it. Sometimes they're really big. They're not the kind of volcano-looking. I hope everybody could make out this very important part of the talk where I'm describing limpets. They're not the same as barnacles, which have a hole on the top. It's a different phylum. Limpets and barnacles. You may be wondering, why am I talking about limpets and barnacles? Because the talk's about inequality in science journalism. So I, too, was trying to think of a way to connect what I did here at Berkeley and then what I did for graduate school and what I write about now. The only thing I can really come up with is that I was really sort of mired in the scientific process. When I see something I don't understand, I try and think of, what's the experiment to try and come up with something like an answer. And then that only leads to the next question. And so now, instead of doing the experiment, I do the reporting and I let the answer to that guide the next question. And these days it seems to be hitting on inequality in all sorts of ways. But it's unexpected. So in this talk, I'm really going to be trying to make an argument that inequality belongs as a subject within science and for science journalists to cover. It's often about politics, it's about geopolitics and economics and history and culture more than science, like as you might have had it in a classroom, so it seems like it doesn't quite fit. But what I'm going to argue is that if you think that the point of science is progress, which is what I believe, well, then there's not going to be progress if the fruits of science aren't widely distributed to people. We can have mRNA vaccines or CRISPR gene therapy or energy-efficient cars, energy-efficient heating, but none of that will matter if only a small portion of the world gets access to it. And I can go even further with this and just suggest that maybe one reason for why society still lags behind in many ways, despite incredible advancements in science in the past 100 years, is because scientists and science writers sort of avoid these issues of distribution and equality. Sometimes I think of a phrase from the sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, who back in the late 1800s, he talked about a peculiar indifference. I'm going to come back to that later in the talk. For now, I kind of just also thought I'd get a sense of who I'm even talking with. So how many people here are journalists or in journalism school? Okay. And then how many people are coming from public health? Neat. And then how many are scientists, not public health? Interesting. Okay, that's cool. I didn't know. So science is my background as well. So after I did the limpet study, then I went on to get a PhD in evolutionary biology from Harvard, and I studied sea spiders. At that point in my life, I was really interested in evolution. There's sort of the natural selection side, but I was interested in the origin side. What's the origin of new body parts? So what I did is I studied, I'll shift this a little bit up. I studied the sea spiders are this very old lineage of arthropods. That's the phylum that includes things like centipedes and crustaceans. They're a very old lineage. They date back a long time. So I looked at how sort of their genes and proteins turn on as they develop body parts and compared that to sort of more recent kin in that family, like the insects. I published my work, my doctoral work in Nature. I was a first author, and I'm showing this slide, showing this paper really just to sort of disavow scientists of a notion that I hear a lot, which is that science writers are just sort of failed scientists. I wasn't a failed scientist. I did well. I chose to leave academia. I got the degree, and then I went into journalism. It's another way to sort of satiate my curiosity, but I could jump around a little bit more. So after I finished grad school, I got a job as a fact checker and assistant at a magazine called Science News in Washington, D.C. From there, I got my first science writing job, which was writing the front section for a journal called the Journal of Experimental Medicine. There was a lot of infectious diseases that we covered there. Often that was kind of in the lab-based sort of studies, what's the life cycle of a malaria parasite, sort of things. But then there was also questions about how these diseases spread. What's the transmission like? And that's outside of the lab. That happens in communities. And that's where I started traveling to different places to see how these diseases spread. Some of the ones that were already listed, Myanmar, Uganda, et cetera. And that's where sort of my scientific questions stopped having science-y answers. They started having answers that were outside of those strict bounds. So I'm going to give an example. Fast forward to 2014, I was really just sort of fascinated by this gigantic Ebola outbreak in West Africa. It's the biggest outbreak the world has ever seen, and I really wanted to see what was going on there. So I decided to go to Sierra Leone. I ended up spending a total of 3 months there. But before I left, I talked to editors at magazines to get a sense of what I'd be writing and making sure I'd have a home for the things I'd be writing. And I went after the topics that science journalists cover, like what are the treatments that are being developed? And something I heard sort of before I left and talking to people was that people weren't going to hospitals because there was a lot of traditional medicine and people, kind of had a lot of superstitions, and this was sort of the reason. So I went to Sierra Leone and I talked to a lot of people, and kind of very quickly, the first things I started to hear about were that people had had really bad experiences in hospitals. Hospitals were overcrowded. There wasn't enough nurses to take care of people, so people didn't have a lot of personal care. Nurses often would ask for money for treatment when treatment should have been free. So people had a bad experience. I heard one story where somebody went in, his grandmother had Ebola, but then they never heard anything back about the grandmother. It had turned out she had died, and the hospital buried her without telling the family. So people had these horrible experiences. So what's going on? That's why I decided to go to hospitals. One thing was, in the local papers at that time, there was news about protests. A lot of hospitals had protests where health workers were protesting because they hadn't been paid and they weren't protected. Spent a lot of time at one hospital. It was in a city in the east of the country called Kenema. And kind of the first thing I noticed when I got there was that on a number of walls, there were just flyers covering the walls. And these were all nurses, doctors, lab technicians, ambulance drivers who had all died of Ebola. And it was super sad because they died within a short period of time, and you could see the birthdays on these flyers, and people were in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, they were young, and they died taking care of people. So it's extremely sad. During this period, a lot of health workers stopped working. It's dangerous. They didn't want to die for this. And those who decided to keep working did so for a couple of reasons. One is that they were really dedicated. The other reason is that people are really poor. There's a lot of poverty in Sierra Leone. I went to a lot of nurses' homes, and they live in homes on dirt floors. They had roofs that leak in the rainy season. And so the allure of having hazard pay, which is what was offered for working, was also really important to people, that they got paid for this dangerous work. And I was literally pulled into this story when I came to this hospital in Kenema. There was a group of ambulance drivers that heard I was a journalist and immediately flagged me over to come talk with them because they were so furious that weeks and months had passed and this hazard pay they were promised wasn't arriving. Here's just one photo. Like I said, everyone wanted to talk about this who was working there. There was a young man who was working in the morgue, and he really wanted me to come see where he was sleeping. So he was very poor. He's a refugee from Liberia. He needed this hazard pay to actually buy food. He had no home. And so he had agreed to work in the morgue where he was sleeping overnight. So he showed me sort of his mattress in a corner of the morgue. And he would work there during the night, so when they'd bring in bodies, he would be there to prep them. And he did it because he really needed the money, and yet he wasn't paid. So you can imagine he was really upset, and he kept working because he was hoping that the pay would come through. I ended up being so moved by this problem that I spent months on this story. And it's not that there was no money in the country. About $3 billion in aid had been donated to West Africa during the Ebola outbreak. And there had been a portion of that set aside from the World Bank that was supposed to go to health workers in the national system. And the World Bank contracted the UN to distribute the money. A UN agency, the UNDP, was supposed to get the money to people. So what went on? You can read sort of this longer story in Newsweek. I made it a little bit longer, and you can get it on Amazon. But the long and the short of it is there was no system for payment. So there was no real payroll. So there would be ledgers, handwritten ledgers of who worked when. But remember, there was people leaving and people coming to work. So it was a complicated system. And there was no real digital payroll that said who was working and when across the country. And on top of that, people needed to be paid in cash because a lot of people didn't have bank accounts. So it's a bit complicated, but it's not like creating a vaccine. But that was sort of the real problem at the end of this. It's not an exciting story. It was hard to sell this story. I had never gone to Sierra Leone to write about payrolls. But I felt like it was important to cover because this was sort of a reason why health workers were feeling dejected. I talked to a lot of people who said they would never work in an outbreak again. This is why nurses were asking for monies because they weren't being paid. This is why people were often not coming into hospitals. It is a big problem. So after I got back, I moved to Berkeley after this sort of experience. I got back and I was really excited. I got an invitation to Google's Sci-Fu Unconference. It's where they invite like some of the top scientists in the country to come and find out what are the biggest problems, and Google researchers will work with other research on solving the biggest problems, finding the biggest solutions. So I was excited. I'd have all these people to listen to me. Ebola was news at that point, so people were interested in the Ebola outbreak. But when I started talking about payrolls, people were almost like disgusted. They did not want to hear about this or disappointed. This like could not be more boring. They were talking about big problems and big out-of-the-box solutions. And so I still, think about why is this not an interesting problem? I can get it, it's not sexy. I mean, I think if I had come and I had said, how about using AI to find drug targets in the Ebola virus? I feel like that is what they were looking for. But the problem was, that wasn't the problem that I saw. There might be other reasons. We could think of a whole bunch of them. Maybe another one is, I think, hearing about terrible injustices happening to people who are far away, to West Africans, makes people a little bit uncomfortable, especially people who are comfortable. And so maybe it's a little bit easier to sort of just not talk about it or to say, this isn't my domain, it's not my area of work. It's speculative, but we're moving forward. It's the COVID pandemic. 2020, I myself was shocked that the US did so badly handling this. So pretty clear, I don't really need to go anywhere even if I could. I can stay right here at home. So by April, May, it's becoming clear that Black people are being infected and dying at higher rates than white people. At that point in time, I was a full-time journalist at Nature, so we look at preprints, we look at what scientists are talking about, we look at papers coming out. There's a lot of scientists sort of talking about, is there sort of immune system differences? Are there cytokine profiles that are different in Black people compared to white people? Could this explain the disparity? Myself and a few other people on our news team were feeling like, this isn't quite right. Kind of a big glaring issue was that there were other groups of people that were disproportionately affected. Hispanic people, early on, it was pretty clear that they were having higher rates of infection and death. If you went to other countries, Singapore, Bangladeshis had higher rates of COVID. In London, South Asians had higher rates of COVID than white people. So clearly it can't just be, the big answer can't be a biological reason. It doesn't work out that way. The annoying thing to me, and I think to many other people, was that this happens so many times, the same sort of lineup and clamoring for a biological answer. We can go back to the late 1800s. There was a difference in life expectancy between Black and white people in the US. There were some scientists suggesting that this was biological. There must be some sort of reason for why Black people have a lower life expectancy or higher mortality rates. So that's where the sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois comes in, and he does a study where he maps Philadelphia. He maps the mortality rates among Black and white people in Philadelphia. And what he ends up finding is that in wars where there's better education, where there's higher rates of employment, where there's better housing, white and Black people have the same life expectancy, or the same mortality rates. And so what he concludes is that it's not race that matters, but the condition of people's lives. So these conclusions are super important, because if the answer is biological, there is no need to sort of confront societal issues. But if the answer is the conditions of people's lives, well, then you have to think about how will you improve housing? How do you improve access to education and jobs? This study is also really beautiful. It's online, and if you can't find it, you can email me and I'll send it to you, because it's a great study, because it has studies used to be really long and some of them were quite good. So this is one of those where it's a very long discussion section in this. And he goes on to pose other questions, such as, if it's so clear that these conditions are bad for people, why are scientists and why is society not so reluctant to sort of address these issues? And here he kind of diverts his attention away from, what is happening within Black people to ask what's happening within society, and by that he means mainly white society, and what's making this peculiar indifference come about. Back to me, it's 2020, I'm here in Berkeley, I'm in my leggings thinking about how am I gonna cover health disparities, and I wanna see what's really driving them. And I know I've been enough places to know you've gotta actually be in a place to see what's driving a situation, and it's often very specific. The closest hotspot to me at that time was in the Central Valley, or specifically the San Joaquin Valley. They had, an emergency declared there. That's where there wasn't, enough space in the morgue, so they had trucks pulled in. It was really bad. I think you all know where the San Joaquin Valley is, but here it is in California. It's close to us. It's only a few hours away. This is the same place. It's the hotbed of agriculture in the U.S. It's also one of the poorest places in the U.S. If the San Joaquin Valley were its own state, it would be among the top 5 poorest states. And it's been this way for a long time. These are photos from Dorothea Lange. John Steinbeck wrote about it. So that's where I wanted to go. So what I did is I went down to the San Joaquin Valley and I talked with a lot of people. So one thing I did is I walked around farms and I met farm workers. I knew so little going into this that this is where I had to learn that farm workers are the people who work on the farm and farmers are the people that own the farms and may or may not even be there. I also got to learn, what it looks like, how our grapes come to us. So nicely picked of all the straggling little stems. And while I talked to farm workers, they were busy working and bundling grapes in bags because they're paid by the pallet. So their time was really valuable. So I went to farms. I talked to a lot of farm workers. I also talked with community organizations, and they connected me with people who I met at home. I went to a food distribution site. I went to clinics. I went to COVID testing sites. And that's where I just talked with lots and lots of people. One thing is I got to learn about people's lives just generally outside of COVID. At a clinic, for example, I met a woman who complained of chronic pain. When I was talking with her, she told me a little of her life, just briefly, but what she does is she goes to work around 10 p.m. at a chicken packing plant, and that's where she would spend the entire night sorting chicken parts in a really cold room. She stressed that it was extremely cold. Around 5 a.m. she would go home and get her kids ready for school, and then take them to school, and then do her day errands. I talked with another woman who was an undocumented immigrant who just told me about when she worked on the farm, there's often supervisors who will kind of move from farm to farm with the same collection of farm workers, but she had a supervisor that would not give her her money or steal her money, basically, and threatened to call the police if she complained about it. So people don't have health care. A lot of people don't have labor protections. There was a lot of poverty, and kind of worst of all, people didn't have a whole lot of agency to do anything about these problems. It's a setup for a really bad time with a transmissible disease. So the pictures here are from a food distribution. This happens often on weekends. The particular one I went to is this picture of the cars. It was in Mendota, and this particular one was happening on a large farm. And basically what happens here is kind of behind those palm trees, there's a huge parking lot. And in one corner of the parking lot, there's people giving out boxes of food. In another corner, there's kind of information on what to do with how to get help paying your electricity bills and your energy bills and your phone bills. And in another huge section of the parking lot was big tents for free COVID testing. Those areas were empty. So I wanted to know what was going on. I talked to the people who do the swabbing, and they said it's always like this at these events. They said, I don't think people here believe in COVID, or they're just over it. People were saying that way back in 2020. So they were saying, so they're just over it. But look, there's all these cars, and I've got time on my hands, and I have a translator I'm working with, so we just go car to car, knocking on the window and talking with people. pretty briefly, but I keep it short. Are you getting tested for COVID? Why not? And that's when everything comes out. Maybe I didn't meet these people, but I didn't meet people who said they didn't believe in COVID. What I heard was really a ton of frustration. So I talked with people who had COVID and had kept working because they need money that they make every day. They desperately need that money. Remember, we're in line for handouts of food for people who make our food. People also kept working when they were really sick because everybody told me they had heard of people who had been fired for saying they had COVID. There was a feeling that they were replaceable. So if they can't come in, the supervisor will find somebody else to take their spot. I talked with somebody who said her husband was really sick with severe COVID, problems breathing. He was in bed. He couldn't get out of bed for more than a month, but he was terrified of going to the hospital. At that time, the Trump administration had kind of threatened to say that if people showed up at the ER, then they could call ICE. And so people were terrified of this. The fear of deportation and being separated from your family loomed even larger than the fear of not having health care. Also, there were some people that just didn't trust that doctors and hospitals would treat them well just because everything else that they had seen was to show that people didn't really care for their lives. So you can imagine people are still going about their lives, going to work when they're sick. COVID spreads. It spreads on farms and food processing plants and meat packing plants. It's hard on communities that already have it hard. So what can scientists do about all this? Well, for one, scientists collect data. And there are a lot of studies that sort of back up the prediction that this is going to be hard. For example, here's one that shows that agriculture workers in California during 2020 had a 40% increased risk of dying compared to the average Californian. There's also studies showing that this isn't just a problem for people on farms or just a problem for people in meatpacking plants. Here's one study that was really only over 5 months in 2020, and it only looked at known outbreaks at livestock plants, which is not all of them. And that estimated that up to 5,200 people had died of COVID just due to those outbreaks at livestock plants that spread to the surrounding community. So this is all really important work. It backs up what we would have predicted. And why does it back up what we would have predicted? Well, because it happens every time. It's quite often that people who are poor, people who are marginalized are going to get hit worse by whatever sort of disease is going around. We can go back to a typhus epidemic in Eastern Europe in the mid-1800s. Rudolf Virchow was a physician, and he was tasked with going to Upper Silesia. Doesn't exist anymore. It was in Eastern Europe. He's tasked with going there and seeing why typhus is spreading. So he goes, and after spending some time there, his conclusion is basically that people are being exploited, and therefore they're not able to protect themselves from this disease. He writes, "The plutocracy did not recognize the Silesians as human beings, but only as tools." That particular line kind of stung when I read it, because when I had been in the San Joaquin Valley, I had a number of farm workers talk to me about this word essential worker, where they were starting to sort of question that word. What part's essential? Is it their work that's essential, or is it their lives? And kind of the resounding answer seemed to be their work. At that time, still there was so much discrimination that people told me about. So this line seems like it really echoes a lot of what I saw. Rudolf Virchow is also a wonderful writer, so he wrote a lot more than just this one report. And I'm going to show one of his quotes because it sort of backs up the thing I'm trying to argue here. He writes, "Medicine has placed us in a position of confronting directly the problems of our times." So basically, he recognizes that covering inequality really is a part of our job. So, have we confronted the great problems, or are we indifferent? As society. And at times, we have actually confronted it. There was massive economic inequality in the 1920s, and it was sort of reined in the decades that followed, starting with the New Deal. There was a minimum wage established. There were some worker protections established. Raises, people got raises, wages increased, there was expanded social services. In this slide, you can see that between the 40s and the 70s, incomes grew and the gap between rich and poor people stayed about the same. And then in the 80s, there's a divergence. This is around the presidency of Ronald Reagan, but this continues through Republican, Democrat presidents ever since then. There's a number of reasons for why this is the case, why we see growing inequality, but some of them are tax cuts for the wealthy and axing of social benefits. There's stagnant wages for people who earn low incomes, and there's just soaring wages for people who earn higher incomes. Here's one statistic just to give you a picture of that. In 1965, the average CEO's salary was 20 times the frontline workers. By 2019, it's nearly 300 times as large. We know this matters to health. There's studies showing how wealth correlates with health. On the whole, people who have more money tend to live longer than people who have less. There's also some studies suggesting that inequality itself correlates with health. In this graph, the 0 would mean that everybody has exactly the same amount of money, and a 1 would mean that one person has all the money and 99 have nothing. Everything's in between those two extremes. But what we can see here, I think, nature, we looked at the G20 countries, but the US is one of the most unequal among all other rich countries and also has the shortest lifespan. And this could be a reason why. So that's economic stuff. Not my background, not a lot of your backgrounds. What could scientists do to even deal with this? Well, one option is to just avoid it. It's not our deal. It's not our business. And I'll show you what that can kind of look like. So here's like a study from the CDC. This is from 2020. It's in the CDC's journal, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. They're not the only ones to do this. I'm just picking on them. And so this report basically shows that Hispanic people in the US had alarmingly higher rates of death from COVID than white people did. And they talk about a lot of the possible reasons for why. And among those are more chance of living in a dense household, more in-person work, less health care. The recommendation here is to wash hands, wear masks, and socially distance. To me, that's just like not very good science. There's no way you say a problem is less healthcare and then say, wash your hands. It doesn't really make sense, first of all, so it's weird. The other thing I guess I would say is that I think maybe it's partly this avoidance of some of these root problems that might explain why in the 170 years since Rudolf Virchow wrote about the typhus epidemic, we're still dealing with the same old problems in public health. Think about other fields of science where there's been, so many advances. Bacteria, viruses discovered, vaccines developed, antibiotics developed, gene therapy, etc. And I don't want to belittle these problems because they're huge problems. They're really massive problems I'm talking about, and they're not simple to solve. They're complex. But I feel like for me, reporting on them and for other people who work on them, that's where we can start to see at least solutions or at least the challenges blocking the way. When I was in the San Joaquin Valley, like I said, I spent a lot of time with community organizations. There's a lot of them there. There's community organizations for African Americans. There's community organizations that work with refugees from Southeast Asia. There's community organizations that work with indigenous people from Oaxaca. There's all sorts of groups. And they sort of banded together when the San Joaquin Valley was hit really hard to say, look, we're facing a lot of the same problems. And they ended up working with some researchers and some doctors at local institutions and at local universities. They formed something called the COVID Equity Project. They did some things you might have guessed, like, for example, in one of these photos, she's handing out masks to farm workers and farm worker supervisors and also kind of talking about the latest news about COVID. There's nothing like an in-person conversation, especially when it's in somebody's language. The other thing that these groups do is they get involved with contact tracing and compare sort of what they do to sort of these ideas that floated around in 2020 that we're going to have like apps that do contact tracing. To me, having seen contact tracing before, that always seemed like a fool's errand. I mean, the idea that you're going to get a ding on your phone and suddenly know how to do all of the things that contact tracing wants you to do. So to give you an example, of the type of things that these community organizations would do because they're close with the communities. For example, Aurelia Mendez here, who's in the middle, she was telling me about how when she called somebody who had COVID, by the time she reached him, he was in the hospital. He, I think, was in the ICU, she said. he was doing really badly and he was crying, but it turned out he was terrified of being evicted, of him and his family being evicted because he hadn't been able to pay rent. So then she and her group went about trying to figure out how they can keep that from happening. Is there temporary assistance they can offer? Another thing that I heard a lot about is people wouldn't be able to isolate or quarantine because they needed food, so they'd figure out food drop-offs. So I think one thing that comes out of this is this lesson that public health might be able to meet more of its goals by working more closely with community organizations. Of course, like something else I wanted to learn about while I was there was what health departments are doing. What kind of quickly became apparent, especially like, when I was in Fresno, is that health departments were in a really tough position. So on one hand, they sort of knew some of the things that needed to happen. And they had community organizations saying, listen, we need free mobile testing that comes to farms. We need to have support for sick leave. They were pushing for these things. On the other hand, the public health department had less power than some of the policymakers. In this case, it was the Fresno Board of Supervisors, and their interest was the economic well-being, by that of the county, and so they were often supporting big ag. They were supporting the people that own the big farms and the people that own the big meatpacking plants because they want to make sure that they're doing okay. And those two groups were often at odds. And the health department often didn't have the power to overrule the policymakers. That's not always true. Here's one story. This is Dr. Salvador Sandoval. He is an officer at the Merced Health Department in the San Joaquin Valley. And he was really surprised to hear some rumors that there was an outbreak going on at the meatpacking plant in his county, that there had even been some deaths. This is a photo of a funeral for somebody from the plant. So he was alarmed and he asked Foster Farms for a list of all of the infections that had been at the plant. So they send him a list and he's looking through the names and he's alarmed to see that some people are listed as deceased. That's shocking. If you think COVID has a 1 in 100 death rate, then that means there's a pretty large outbreak if you're seeing people deceased. Of course, that's before the vaccines. And that's a rough estimate. So I know we have scientists here. Anyways, so he says, all right, we want to stop this outbreak. So he asked the meatpacking plant to temporarily shut down so that they can test everyone and make sure they put an end to the outbreak. The plant refuses to shut down, so he goes to the California Department of Health and also California's Occupational Safety Department, Cal-OSHA, and he asks for their support. They're willing to support him, and they're working on this through the bureaucracy of this, but then the Merced Health Department gets a call from a federal official from the USDA who says, in fact, Trump has issued an executive order that meatpacking plants are to remain open. They're an essential service within the U.S., so there's no closing of this plant. So this is really upsetting. He's distraught. As time goes on, more people die. I think they get to around 8 deaths from COVID linked to the plant. And that's when they're able to ask Foster Farms to partially close down one part of the plant for 6 days where they can test everyone. After my story comes out, actually, Dr. Sandoval sends me an email and says, this was blood, sweat, and tears. So I guess the moral is they did overcome the problem, but it was really hard. Again, the need here, if we're thinking about the next pandemic, is what kind of policies can be in place to give health departments a little bit more leverage in an emergency. So this piece is, you can read, I didn't give away all of the details, just a lot of them, but there's also, more graphs and whatnot, and the piece that's in Nature, and we also made an episode in the Corona Pod at Nature about this. They both have won a lot of awards, and what makes me happy about these awards is they're from scientific journalism societies and science societies. To me, that says, okay, it took a lot to push to say this is something that should be a part of science journalism, and this says, yeah, there is an appetite for this sort of thing. This year and last year, I kind of turned my attention to international situations, to the COVID vaccine inequities. To me, it's insane that we were able to develop mRNA vaccines within about 10 months, and yet it takes more than 2 years to get them around the world. It's awful that, I got my third mRNA dose around December 2021 at a time when just 6% of people in low-income countries had even a single dose of any vaccine, never mind an mRNA vaccine, which are our most effective right now. So again, this is predictable. If you talk to people in public health, there's a lot of drugs and vaccines that took many years to reach low and middle income countries. To sort of probe this question, I looked at an initiative that's trying to change the situation, to make developing countries less reliant on sort of this goodwill trickle-down approach. And in covering them, I'm finding that the challenges that they're bumping up against are a lot of the challenges that have kept this imbalance in place. I don't need to ruin this entire story for you. So anyways, here it is. It's in Nature. You can read it. And yeah, making, this kind of imbalance, just like the livestock plant infections spreading, having low and middle income countries not be fully protected is bad for all of us. We're all connected here. I thought I would end this talk on sort of a positive note, if I can. So sometimes I'm wondering, what am I doing? I'm too out of my lane to be writing about these things. But lately I've been living in New York City, and I happen to be living across from some high rises, and this is a plaque outside one of these high rises that was a co-op. The plaque is very idealistic. The reason why I like it is this one line. It says, "We want to have an America where the inventions of science will be at the disposal of every American family, not merely for the few." So again, that brings me back to my point in the beginning. If you believe in the ability of science to drive progress, then you need to also care about making sure that the inventions of science have a reach. A kind of other reason why I love this plaque is that it gives me hope. It kind of reminds me why I'm a journalist. The author of the words is a Russian immigrant and also a labor organizer named Sidney Hillman. And it was his writing and his idealism and his work that actually helped drive the New Deal. That was that big economic revolution that I mentioned earlier. It's good to remember that big changes can happen, so they can happen again. But in order to get there, we need to dig at the real problems, we need to study the real problems, and we need to push on those problems in order to have any kind of progress. So that's it for my talk. There's a ton of people to thank for all of this work, but among them, my editors at Nature and at Newsweek, which were on all of the stories that I talked about today. I want to thank the Kavli Center and also the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship Program, because the stories I talked about, all of them took a long time. They required travel, more than a lot of news outlets can bear to spend on. And so this is sort of how I did the reporting, was with these fellowships. I also want to thank the AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Awards Program, UC Berkeley, and the Kavli Center for Ethics, Science, and the Public that sponsored and hosted this talk. Thank you.
We do have time for questions, so Amy, I'll allow you to maybe
Okay.
your own questions here for a few minutes, and I'll let you know when we're done.
Does anybody have any questions? Jess.
I have a question about your last story with the vaccine
Yeah.
development. I was wondering if you have you followed up? Do you know where things stand with their progress?
Yeah, so this story was,
Can you repeat the question?
oh yeah, great. So the question was, what's the progress, when I talked about how there was a program to sort of change this imbalance. So the question, what's the progress on that program? I didn't talk much about it, but basically the initiative is an initiative, it's a long name, the mRNA Vaccine Technology Transfer Hub. It's sort of an initiative led by the WHO, but based in South Africa, where they're developing mRNA vaccines and also teaching researchers at more than a dozen companies in different developing countries how to make the vaccine, with the hope that this can become, to boost vaccine manufacturing, and they're all in the global south. So where are they at? They actually were able to kind of make a mimic of Moderna's vaccine. They're testing that vaccine right now in animals to see if it truly is the same. I think the group in South Africa did it. Last I heard, the group in Argentina was also able to do it. I just read an announcement. So part of the other issue with this was like, who's going to buy these vaccines? Because they might cost more. And I just saw an announcement from Gavi, which buys vaccines for a lot of low-income countries, that they, at least temporarily, they're willing to try and see how they can make this work if they can buy those vaccines if they're at a higher price. Thanks. Hi. Yes.
So a couple slides back, and certainly in what you said, you talked about science helping fix this problem.
Yeah.
And I guess it depends on how broadly you define science. But one could argue that the problems which you eloquently described are political and social problems. And that science may not be the right way to fix them. If you include social science perhaps, or political science, then maybe, but I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on how you think science can help.
True. I mean, it's a hard question and kind of one I should have expected, which is, the question is, if these problems are economic and political, as I said in the beginning, how is science supposed to address them? And that's completely true. It's very difficult. I would say, for one, to start with, not ignoring them. So I think a lot of scientists sort of want to pretend that problem doesn't exist and it's just not their duty to think about. So maybe incorporating them into studies from the beginning. Maybe it means that, it's hard to say this in a general way because every kind of issue is going to be its own issue. But if it's about, I'm trying to think of a good example, but whatever it's about, maybe from the beginning sort of predicting, how is this going to play out in the real world? And can I maybe work with people, if it's an issue with patents, can I work with people who are, patent experts and figure out how we're going to get around this? Or if it's an issue with occupational safety hazards, maybe it's about working with people who've been in that field for a long time. Maybe it's a matter of thinking harder about getting involved with policy somehow and working on that.
So just to follow up,
Yeah.
Science might help us come up with a cheaper vaccine or a faster vaccine or
Yes.
refrigeration or whatever it is that could help make some of these challenges more addressable
Yeah.
in the real world. So I get that science piece.
Yeah.
But we saw that, we in public health, at least in my field, like to say, vaccines don't prevent illness, vaccinations do.
Yes.
And if, we could get the vaccine to storage facilities in the capital city, but not into the arms of people.
Right.
So is that amenable to a scientific fix, or is that really
Do you mind repeating that, Amy?
Yeah, sorry. So the question is, there's a saying that vaccines don't prevent illness, vaccination does, meaning the vaccine has to get into somebody's arm to work. It's not just the pure vaccine in a vial that does it. And so is that a scientific fix? Yeah, I mean, you can help by having a vaccine that's more stable at warmer temperatures. So that's the science part of it. And I don't mean to say that we don't need anybody working on the science side. Clearly, people have to work on the science side. But I think it's about kind of thinking about what else are going to be the problems. If we know early on that the distribution of getting the vaccine into people is going to be a hurdle, you can't only, besides just making a vaccine that might be stable at warmer temperatures, maybe early on, there was an Operation Warp Speed to develop vaccines. Maybe there should be a warp speed to think, how are we really going to get this to people? In our own country, we have such a big problem with an anti-vaccination movement. So maybe there could have been more thought up front. What is the way that we're going to reach people? Even now with the boosters, there's an alarming number of people who are older who haven't gotten their boosters. So maybe there should have been more work on really how do we reach these people and put a ton of work into that. And where scientists come in, no, maybe they're not the people knocking on doors, but maybe they're part of the people who are saying, listen, you're paying for me to, make a new booster or whatever. This is going to be another problem to think about. What's sort of interesting is there's a researcher, Barney Graham, who helped make Moderna's vaccine or helped Moderna with their vaccine. And he's now really interested in this problem. So he's sort of interested in saying, he's one of the people that's helping the hub in South Africa because he's saying, this is a vaccine. My vision is to have this made all over the world. And so he's, not driving the whole effort, but he's there to do his piece or to help in that way. So I guess that would be my thought. I think I saw your hand. Is that right?
I want to switch the question of, is this a science problem, from what the answer was, to more of the direction of, is this a higher education problem? During No Child Left Behind, 3 administrations ago, we saw that the focus on teaching to the test meant that everybody got a lot of English and math and they didn't get any humanities or STEM, and then this pendulum swung in the direction of STEM, and now education is let's focus on STEM. And so people don't have any sociology. So sociology, as part of the prep of an undergraduate education before you go into your specialization in STEM, never seems to happen. So it seems like sociology or sociological perspective, the Du Bois perspective, has been eclipsed in the preparation of people who are going to go into these careers that can make these changes. So it's a long thing to repeat. But I wonder if you want to, if rather than saying, oh, is this something that we need to bring to science, isn't this something we need to bring to the education of STEM majors? By saying STEM majors ties into the Kavli Ethics Center issue as well. I'm saying, shouldn't STEM majors have had some exposure to sociological perspectives so that these kinds of things don't come as a surprise to them once they get out into the field?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The question is, or the comment is, should STEM students have more exposure to sociology? And I would say absolutely. Something sort of embarrassing, but I'm not embarrassed. As a journalist, you kind of get a pass for being constantly stupid in a lot of subjects because you're just waltzing in there. And what I've realized is all these things I think I figure out, like anthropologists are like, well, yeah, like all the time. And I never studied anthropology, but it's one of those cases where it turns out there's somebody that already has studied this for a long time. So yeah, I completely agree. There's not enough focus on that. Yeah?
So it seems like a common theme has been that these kinds of stories are hard to tell and hard to convince people are worth telling. How do you convince science outlets that these are science stories?
A lot of persistence. So I think it's a lot of pushing. You have to be a little pushy, maybe a little pushing, but also you have to. I think when you're writing, you also have to convince people that you're telling a true story and a good story. So, if I was making a vague rant, I think it would be difficult. But if I've got a good story and I've backed it up and I've done the reporting and I've done the work and I can connect it to science, I think then I get some motion in there. Also, something that helps is talking with scientists, because it turns out for this story too, a lot of scientists had opinions on this piece. I talked to Professor Reingold on this. So a lot of people had opinions. So when you talk to scientists, then I can kind of make it a science story because it's something scientists care about. It's a little trick I've learned. Yeah.
I have a question about you mentioned that the healthcare center at San Joaquin had to battle with the meat packing, that side of the policy making. Do they have to battle with the immigration center, to convince people that they don't need to have valid documentation to get the treatment that they need, or get the vaccines, the testings that they need? Was there any effort in reassuring that they won't get evicted just to get tested?
There was effort. I don't know how it worked on the policy side, but I'm sure because at some point there was money to cover sick leave, and then there was an effort to not ask for documentation at COVID testing sites and things like that. But I don't know what that was like, so I just don't know what the kind of background to that push was.
So my question relates to misinformation and addressing misinformation, but also how do we restore trust in science journalism? And the reason I say that is I think that sometimes we think because research has come from a R1 university, etc., that it's trustworthy, but we also know that there's instances where science has also contributed to medical racism, has also contributed to inequality. And so there is this false sense of like objectiveness that I think sometimes it gets lost in the public, that maybe scientists are blind to. So I guess I'm curious, how do we address that? Because I think that we, as scientists, might have an understanding of what is rigorous sciences, but what is rigorous science, but I think also understand that we do have to build trust with the public that what we're saying is true, especially when there's going to be contrarian information.
Yeah. I mean, it's a massive problem, and I don't have like a simple answer. Oh, I'm sorry, I keep doing this. So the question was about, you know, how to overcome misinformation, especially when it's linked to, you know, when scientists and the healthcare, how do I say, scientists and healthcare has been racist in the past, and it continues to show discrimination. So people might not trust those things for very good reason. So how to overcome that? I don't have simple answers. I meant it when I said I had some inspiration in the San Joaquin Valley. These community organizations were really kind of wonderful because they were a trusted source of information, and there was sort of a chain that went on there where, you know, they would learn information within this COVID equity project because there were also, and what I kind of liked in this is the institutes and the universities that were working with this project were kind of smaller local institutes. They weren't sort of the big, you know, names in the room. But, you know, they would talk about kind of what's the latest in COVID, and then the community organizations would then bring it out, and they were part of the community. These were their neighbors. So they would talk with people, and they were trusted, and they also were trusted because they cared, you know. They didn't just say, okay, hey, like, who are your contacts? We'll write down their names or whatever. They said, what do you need? Do you need food? You know, they would sort of go that extra mile and showing that they should be people that people can trust. So I guess that was sort of why I feel like it's a great thing and something we might look to more. I'm sure there's better answers, but that's all I've got.
Got one question from live stream. It'll be our last
Okay.
question of the evening.
Okay, so we have a question online that's asking, thank you very much for this work and for your insights about inequality as a crucial consideration for scientists and science journalists. What kinds of reactions have you gotten from those two groups? So reactions from scientists and reactions from science journalists. If you could still repeat.
Yeah. So what's been the response from scientists and from science journalists? I would say good. I'm kind of grateful for that because it's always a surprise. These are not like the typical issues to cover. And my stories are often long, so I'm almost surprised when people say they've read them. But on the whole, good. I think there is an appetite for this now. I really do feel like we're living in some tense times. I think it's clear to a lot of people that something's wrong. And I think there is a lot of people who are looking for, you know, how do we change this somehow? Thanks.
Thank you, Amy, for a great talk and lots for us to talk about. I hope that those of you who are here can join us outside for a small reception. Thank you.